Welcome to Deep Awakening. In this space, we uncover forgotten stories, objects shrouded in mystery, and secrets that have crossed centuries, or that spark a sense of strangeness and an irresistible curiosity. Today, you're about to discover another mysterious and astonishing chapter of the letter that changed the destiny of two countries and was burned out of fear. Get ready. The story begins now. History often hinges on moments that seem fleeting at first glance. A whispered conversation, a signed document, or a single letter that carries the weight of nations. Imagine holding in your hands a piece of parchment that, had it been discovered, might have redrawn the maps we know today. This is the story of such a letter, one so dangerous that its recipient chose to destroy it rather than risk its discovery. A letter that, for a brief moment, held the fate of two nations in its delicate folds. What would drive someone to burn the very evidence of a historical turning point? What secrets did those ashes carry into oblivion? In the dimly lit study of a grand manor house in Madrid, Spain, in the late autumn of 1808, a quill scratched across parchment by candlelight. Outside, Napoleonic forces were tightening their grip on the Iberian Peninsula. Inside, a desperate plan was taking shape in the form of a letter that would alter the course of not one, but two nations. The early 19th century was a period of immense upheaval across Europe and the Americas. The Napoleonic Wars had thrown the established order into chaos, and Spain was suffering under French occupation. King Ferdinand VII had been forced to abdicate, and Napoleon had placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people were in revolt, and the colonial territories in the Americas were watching carefully, seeing opportunity. In the mother country's distress, Spain's vast empire was beginning to fracture. In Mexico, then known as New Spain, tensions were building. The rigid colonial caste system had created deep social divides, with peninsulares, Spanish-born whites, at the top, followed by criollos, American-born whites, mestizos, mixed Spanish, and indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans at the bottom. Economic hardship, compounded by years of poor harvests and excessive taxation to fund Spain's European wars, had pushed the colony to a breaking point. It was against this backdrop of political turmoil and social unrest that our letter was crafted, a document that would connect these two distant but intimately linked nations in a conspiracy that neither government would ever officially acknowledge. The author of this fateful letter was not some grand statesman or recognized historical figure. He was Carlos María de Álvarez y Mendizábal, a mid-level diplomat in the Spanish Foreign Office who had spent years in New Spain and had developed deep sympathies for the criollo cause. Álvarez had returned to Spain just before the French invasion and found himself caught between loyalties to his king, to his country, and to the people he had come to admire across the ocean. Álvarez was part of a small but influential group of liberal Spanish officials who believed that granting greater autonomy to the colonies might preserve the empire in some form, rather than losing it entirely to revolution. They operated in secret, knowing that such views could be considered treasonous. The creation of the letter itself was an exercise in secrecy. Álvarez wrote late at night, using a special ink of his own formulation that appeared ordinary, but could reveal hidden text when treated with a specific chemical solution, a technique he had learned from his time working with diplomatic communications. The parchment was of the finest quality, light enough to be concealed easily, but durable enough to survive the long journey across the Atlantic. What made this letter extraordinary was not just its contents, but the risk involved in its creation. Álvarez had access to confidential information, detailed reports of Spain's military weaknesses, the extent of French control, and most dangerously, a list of Spanish officials in New Spain who might be sympathetic to independence movements. In essence, he was creating a blueprint for revolution. The letter was addressed to Juan Antonio de Riaño y Bárcena, the intendant of Guanajuato, a region rich in silver mines and one of the economic powerhouses of New Spain. Riaño was known officially as a loyal Spanish administrator, but Alvarez had reason to believe that Riaño harbored private doubts about Spain's continued rule and might be persuaded to support a carefully managed transition to greater autonomy. In, say, official records, Riaño appears as the quintessential Spanish bureaucrat, efficient, loyal, and dedicated to maintaining order. When the Mexican War of Independence broke out in 1810, he would die defending Guanajuato against insurgent forces led by Miguel Hidalgo. This official history paints him as a martyr to Spanish authority, but the letter suggests a more complex figure, one who may have been considering a different path. The letter itself was never intended for official channels. It traveled with a trusted merchant captain who had dealings in both Spain and Mexico, hidden within a false compartment, in a shipment of books destined for Riaño's private library. No official registry or manifest ever recorded its existence. Had it been discovered by French authorities in Spain or by royalist officials in New Spain, both sender and recipient would have faced charges of treason. There are no contemporary descriptions of the letter for obvious reasons, but based on similar diplomatic correspondence of the era, we can imagine it as a carefully folded sheet, sealed with plain wax rather than an official seal that might draw attention. The handwriting would have been neat and economical, making efficient use of the limited space to convey maximum information. The earliest reference to the letter's existence comes not from any official document, but from a cryptic entry in Riaño's personal diary, discovered nearly a century later by his great-grandson and donated to the National Archives of Mexico in 1913. The entry, dated February 17, 1809, reads simply, "Package received from Madrid. Heaven help us with the burden of such knowledge." What makes this letter so fascinating to historians is not just its clandestine nature, but the way it challenges our understanding of how independence movements in Latin America developed. The traditional narrative portrays a clean break, colonies rising up against an oppressive European power. The reality, as this letter suggests, was far more nuanced, with networks of sympathizers on both sides of the Atlantic working toward varied visions of the future. Some scholars have drawn comparisons to other secret correspondences that shaped history, such as the letters between Benjamin Franklin and his British contacts before the American Revolution, or the communications between Irish revolutionaries and their American supporters in the early 20th century. In each case, these hidden exchanges reveal the complexity behind historical changes that public narratives often simplify. The letter represents a moment when history balanced on a knife's edge, when different decisions might have led to entirely different outcomes for both Spain and Mexico. It reminds us that the past we know is just one of many possible paths that might have been taken, that behind every historical event are countless private conversations, secret messages, and personal decisions that nudged events in one direction rather than another. As we delve deeper into this mystery, we must remember that the letter we're discussing wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a dangerous weapon in the political arsenal of its time, one that would soon place its recipient at the center of a life or death decision. By the time Riaño received the letter in early 1809, New Spain was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Bourbon reforms had centralized authority and increased taxation. Indigenous communities had lost lands and autonomy. Criollos felt systematically excluded from the highest levels of government and church offices. All this discontent simmered beneath the surface of colonial society, What Riaño held in his hands that February evening in his study in Guanajuato was not just paper and ink, but fire. The letter detailed the extent of Spain's weakness, how Napoleon's occupation had left the mother country virtually defenseless against colonial uprising. It named specific officials in key positions who might support a coordinated movement toward autonomy. Most explosively, it included a proposed timeline for action and suggested methods for securing key military installations with minimal bloodshed. 1. Antonio de Riaño was 52 years old when the letter arrived, a man who had dedicated his life to administration and governance. Born in Santander, Spain, he had served in the Royal Navy before transitioning to colonial administration. He had married into a prominent Criollo family and had spent decades in New Spain. His position as Intendant of Guanajuato placed him at the helm of one of the wealthiest regions in the colony, responsible for both its prosperity and its security. Riaño's personal papers, preserved fragmentarily in archives, reveal a man of the Enlightenment, educated, rational, and thoughtful. His library contained works by Rousseau and Voltaire, alongside traditional Spanish and religious texts. He had implemented reforms to improve conditions in the silver mines and had shown unusual concern for public health and education. Yet he was still a Spanish official, bound by oath to the crown. The night Riaño read Alvarez's letter was documented indirectly through the recollections of his personal secretary, José María Septién y Montero, who later recorded that his superior had been unusually agitated that evening, ordering the household staff to leave him alone in his study and calling for additional candles well past midnight. What transpired in those private hours can only be surmised, but the decision Riaño faced was monumental. The letter presented him with three possible paths. He could report it to his superiors and maintain his loyalty to Spain. He could embrace its contents and become a leader in a movement toward Mexican autonomy. Or he could destroy it and pretend it had never existed. Each choice carried enormous risk. To report it would implicate Alvarez and potentially other Spanish liberals who sought peaceful reform rather than violent rupture. To act on it would be treason against the crown he had served his entire life. To destroy it might preserve peace temporarily, but would lose the strategic advantage the information provided. Historical records indicate that during the weeks following the letter's arrival, Riaño held a series of private meetings with local Criollo leaders, ostensibly about municipal matters. The guest list included several names that would later appear among supporters of independence, including Juan de Aldama and Ignacio Allende, military officers who would become key figures in the independence movement. The turning point came on March 9, 1809, when Riaño received word that a royalist investigation was underway regarding suspicious correspondence from Spain. Several merchants had been detained and their cargoes searched in Veracruz. Whether this was connected to Alvarez's letter or was simply routine security is unclear, but the news forced Riaño's hand. That night, according to a later account by his wife, Doña María Ana de la Luz Zárate, Riaño burned certain papers in the fireplace of their bedroom, an unusual action that she remembered because it was unlike her methodical husband to destroy documents. She recalled seeing him watch the papers burn completely before stirring the ashes. What exactly burned that night? The historical record cannot tell us with certainty, but the timing and circumstance strongly suggest it was Alvarez's letter. With its destruction, Riaño made his choice, neither complete loyalty nor open rebellion, but a third path of cautious preparation. In the months that followed, Riaño made subtle adjustments to the governance of Guanajuato. He reorganized the militia, placing men with Criollo sympathies in key positions. He implemented economic measures that reduced tax burdens on local businesses. He established a series of public granaries to guard against food shortages. Each action, viewed individually, appeared as prudent governance, but together they laid groundwork for greater local autonomy. The dramatic turn came in September 1810, when the conspiracy for independence was discovered prematurely in Querétaro. The original plan had called for a coordinated uprising in December, but with the conspiracy exposed, Father Miguel Hidalgo decided to act immediately, issuing his famous Grito de Dolores call to arms on September 16th. As Hidalgo's rebel army marched toward Guanajuato, Riaño faced the moment of truth. Despite his apparent sympathies and preparations, when confronted with an actual armed rebellion, disorganized, violent, and threatening the social order, he made the decision to defend the city. He gathered the Spanish and wealthy Criollo families in the city's granary, the Alhóndiga de Granaditas, a fortress-like structure he had reinforced over the previous months. On September 28, 1810, Riaño died defending the Alhóndiga against Hidalgo's forces. His final communications reveal a man torn by conflicting loyalties, to his oath, to peace, to the people he governed. In his last letter to the Viceroy, he wrote, "I shall fulfill my duty to the end, though God knows there might have been better paths had wisdom prevailed. The rebels captured Guanajuato, and in the violence that followed, many Spaniards were killed. The revolution had begun in blood, not through the measured transition that Alvarez's letter had proposed." When news of Riaño's death and the fall of Guanajuato reached Spain, Carlos María de Alvarez attempted to erase all evidence of his communications with New Spain. He resigned his position, citing health concerns, and retreated to his family estate. In Andalusia, he would live another 20 years, but never again held public office or commented on colonial affairs. In the aftermath of Riaño's death, the uprising led by Hidalgo took on a life of its own. Initially successful in capturing several cities, the rebels were eventually defeated by royalist forces. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811. However, the struggle continued under other leaders until Mexico finally achieved independence in 1821. The immediate aftermath of the letter's destruction was a path of independence forged in violence rather than negotiation. Without the coordinated approach outlined in Alvarez's communications, the revolution became a series of regional conflicts, prolonging the struggle for independence and deepening divisions within Mexican society. For Spain, the consequences were equally profound. Rather than an orderly transition that might have preserved economic and cultural ties, the violent rupture created lasting animosity. Spain lost the vast wealth of New Spain almost overnight, deepening its economic crisis and accelerating its decline as a world power. The physical letter itself was reduced to ashes in Riaño's fireplace, but its legacy lived on in the actions and decisions that followed. The network of moderates and reformers that Alvarez had identified largely withdrew from politics after the violence of the early revolution, creating a vacuum that more radical elements filled. Riaño's personal library and papers were scattered after his death. Some were confiscated by revolutionary authorities, others preserved by his family. It wasn't until the early 20th century that historians began to piece together fragments, suggesting the existence of the letter and its influence on his actions. In 1913, during the tumult of the Mexican Revolution, Riaño's great-grandson Luis Zarate Riaño donated a collection of family papers to the National Archives. Among them was the diary with the cryptic reference to the package from Madrid. Historians initially paid little attention to this collection amid the chaos of revolution. It wasn't until the 1950s that historian Luis González y González began a serious investigation into Riaño's role in the independence movement. Working From fragmentary evidence, diary entries, correspondence with other officials, changes in policy, and the recollections preserved in family papers, González proposed the existence of what he called the Madrid connection, suggesting that Riaño had been influenced by liberal elements in Spain. González's work was controversial. Traditional historians on both sides rejected the idea. Spanish scholars, because it implicated their country in the loss of the colony; Mexican nationalists, because it complicated the narrative of a purely homegrown revolution. The debate attracted the attention of British historian Hugh Thomas, who was researching his comprehensive work on the Spanish Empire. Thomas discovered correspondence in the Spanish National Archives from the Minister of Indies to the Viceroy of New Spain, expressing concern about certain disloyal elements within the diplomatic service who may have communicated improperly with colonial officials. The letter named no names, but was dated June 1809, just months after Alvarez's communication would have reached Riaño. In 1972, a previously unknown journal belonging to José María Septieni Montero, Riaño's secretary, was discovered in a private collection in Guanajuato. It contained the passage about Riaño's unusual behavior on the night he presumably received the letter, adding another piece to the puzzle. Physical evidence of the letter itself remains elusive, intentionally so. Its destruction was fundamental to its historical significance. Had it survived, it would have changed the course of events. Its absence is its most important feature. Today, the letter exists in the realm between documented history and informed speculation. No historian can definitively prove its exact contents, but the surrounding evidence strongly suggests its existence and impact. It has become a symbol of the hidden connections and complex loyalties that shaped the independence movements of Latin America. For modern Mexico, the story of the letter offers a more nuanced understanding of national origins. Rather than a simple narrative of oppression and liberation, it suggests a moment when different futures were possible, when independence might have come through evolution rather than revolution. For Spain, it represents one of many missed opportunities to transform its empire before it collapsed, a moment when visionary officials recognized the inevitable but couldn't implement change within an ossified system. The letter reminds us that history is not always made in grand public gestures or battlefield victories, but sometimes in private moments of decision. A man alone in his study, watching a document burn, choosing among impossible options with the fate of nations in his hands. What appears at first glance to be a simple piece of correspondence emerges as something far more profound, a nexus point in history where personal conscience collided with political reality, where loyalty to principles challenged loyalty to institutions, where the ideal of peaceful transition confronted the messy reality of revolution. The letter that burned in Riaño's fireplace that March night in 1809 was more than just paper and ink. It was a vision of a different path, one not taken, and its ashes represent the countless what-ifs that haunt our understanding of the past. In those moments when Riaño watched the letter burn, he wasn't just destroying evidence of a conspiracy. He was making a choice that would reverberate through centuries, a choice that helped shape the nations we know today as Mexico and Spain. The story of this letter reminds us that history is not inevitable. It is made of human choices in moments of crisis, choices based on conscience, fear, hope, and vision. Sometimes the most powerful acts in history are not what people did, but what they chose not to do. The letter not sent, the order not given, the document consigned to flames. In our modern world of digital permanence, where every message leaves traces, there is something profound about a piece of history deliberately reduced to ash. A reminder that some knowledge was once considered too dangerous to preserve, some truths too volatile to acknowledge openly. This letter, existing now only in its absence, challenges us to look more deeply at the official narratives of history, to question the clean lines drawn between enemies and allies, traitors and patriots. It invites us to consider the human beings behind historical events, their doubts, their conflicts of conscience, their attempts to find the least damaging path through impossible circumstances. If you've been moved by this hidden chapter of history, this glimpse behind the curtain of official narratives, we invite you to join our community of seekers and truth finders. Like, comment, and subscribe to Deep Awakening, where we continue to uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our world. Share your thoughts on what this story means to you and what other historical mysteries you'd like us to explore. In a world that often simplifies the past into heroes and villains, we stand for the complexity of human experience and the nuanced truth of history. Join us on this journey of discovery, one hidden story at a time.